Welcome to the deep dive. We take a stack of your sources, articles, research, notes, and really pull out the essential knowledge, the surprising bits, everything you need to be truly well informed.
And for this deep dive, you sent us some really interesting material. It's focused on something I think we all grapple with.
Hmm.
How do we genuinely improve our brain function? Things like concentration, memory, even thinking speed and mood.
Exactly. So the mission here is to unpack the key insights from these sources about boosting cognitive abilities. We want to dig into what the brain actually needs to get better and, well, how to train it effectively.
Right. It seems it's not just about, grinding it out endlessly. There's a specific process these sources highlight.
Yeah, that's what jumped out at me too.
At its core, the sources suggest that most people can see significant improvement. But it's not just through sheer effort. It's about giving the brain that foundational support and triggering the right biological processes.
Okay, let's start there. That foundational support, what does the brain need, according to these sources you sent?
Well, they highlight two absolute essentials. First, sufficient blood flow and oxygen supply.
The delivery system.
Exactly. Think of it like that's how your brain gets all the nutrients and fuel it requires. And second, you need to actively activate the specific brain areas you want to improve or, utilize.
Makes sense. And what about the things that get in the way? The sources list quite a few culprits that can damage brain function, right?
Oh, definitely. The list includes things like poor sleep quality, which is a big one. Also, physical impacts like blows to the head, a sedentary lifestyle, poor nutrition. And they even note much more.
Hmm. So all these factors mess with either that delivery system, the blood flow, or the brain's ability to activate properly.
That seems to be the idea. They compromise the brain's ability to function optimally.
So, okay, if we want to improve intelligence or specific cognitive skills, it really boils down to improving blood flow and figuring out how to get the right parts of the brain firing more effectively.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is where one of the key takeaways from your sources comes in. How to actually get those specific brain areas firing, especially in a way that leads to lasting change, not just a temporary boost.
And that brings us to a really crucial chemical messenger they talk about, acetylcholine.
Yes, acetylcholine. It's highlighted as a key neurotransmitter involved in stimulating specific brain areas. Now, other neurotransmitters like dopamine play roles in motivation and general alertness, sure.
Right.
But the sources really point to acetylcholine as being critically important for focus.
Focus. So acetylcholine helps you zero in on something specific, like a spotlight.
That's a great way to put it. Exactly, like a spotlight. When you focus intently on a specific task or maybe a piece of information, acetylcholine is released in the brain areas involved in processing that specific thing.
Okay, but this focus-driven acetylcholine release, it's not just about temporary attention, is it? The sources seem to connect it directly to neuroplasticity.
Yes, and this is where it gets really powerful. The sources explain that the release of acetylcholine in a focused area acts as a kind of signal. It tells that specific brain area, hey, pay attention, this is important, make changes here.
A signal to rewire, basically.
Exactly. That signal is a major driver for generating new neural connections right there in that specific spot.
And new connections. That means learning faster, adapting, improving skills. That's neuroplasticity in action.
Absolutely. That capacity for your brain to rewire itself, to build new circuits and strengthen existing ones, that is neuroplasticity. And it's a fundamental basis for any permanent improvement in things like memory, attention, or really any skill you want to build.
So it's not just temporary chemical effects we're talking about.
No, not at all. We're talking about lasting structural changes. And that intense, focused effort, mediated by acetylcholine release, is a primary way the sources say we can trigger this.
Okay, so the takeaway here seems pretty clear then. If you want to increase your intellectual capacity, or improve a specific skill, or boost your memory, you have to start by improving your ability to focus completely on the task at hand.
That focus is what releases the acetylcholine signal in the right place. It flags what needs to be changed.
Right, and that leads directly into another concept the sources discuss, targeted training.
Exactly, because different brain areas handle different functions, right? You've got areas for motor skills, others for language, spatial reasoning, and so on.
Makes sense.
So it follows that to improve a specific capacity, you need to train that specific part of your nervous system.
So, like, you can't get better at remembering faces by, I don't know, practicing juggling?
Well, probably not directly, no. The sources use the example of improving text comprehension. How do you actually do that? You concentrate intensely on reading difficult material. And importantly, you actively evaluate afterwards whether you actually understood it. You're focusing the signal, that acetylcholine release, on the parts of the brain involved in processing complex text.
That makes sense. You're training the exact function. There was that anecdote in the sources, too, about someone trying to learn Latin.
Oh yeah, that was a good illustration.
Yeah.
They described trying to study Latin but having absolutely no real internal motivation or seeing any relevance in it for themselves.
So what happened?
Well, the brain in that case just didn't produce sufficient acetylcholine for the task. It didn't prioritize making connections for Latin because the "this is important" signal wasn't really there. The effort felt wasted because the brain wasn't getting flagged to wire it in.
Ah, so it wasn't just about putting in the hours. It was about the quality of that effort. Effort with genuine focus and perceived meaning.
Precisely.
That ties into those phrases from the source. Potencias lo que entrenas, you empower what you train, and entrena lo que tenga sentido para vos, train what actually makes sense to you.
It really underscores that the brain is incredibly efficient. It prioritizes rewiring things you genuinely engage with, focus on, or see value in, because those are the activities releasing that crucial acetylcholine signal in the relevant areas.
Okay, so focus and acetylcholine are key for providing the stimulus for change. How do we support this whole acetylcholine system then? Can we just, boost our levels somehow?
Well, the sources mention a couple of approaches. First, there are dietary sources. Choline is a precursor to acetylcholine, right?
Right.
And foods rich in choline, like egg yolk and liver, are noted. But the sources also caution that the evidence for significant brain acetylcholine increases purely from diet alone. Well, it seems stronger in animal studies than in human ones.
Okay, so maybe not a magic bullet through food. What about supplements?
Yes, supplements are discussed. For increasing the available choline precursors, the sources specifically point to alpha-GPC and citicoline, that's also known as CDP-choline, as being the most effective options they mention.
Got it. Alpha-GPC, citicoline. And then there was another angle mentioned, wasn't there? Something about inhibiting the destruction of acetylcholine.
Yes, that's a significant strategy highlighted in the sources. Substances like ginkgo biloba, huperzine A, sometimes spelled huperzina A, and Bacopa monnieri are mentioned.
Why those?
Because they seem to help prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine after it's been released into the synapse.
Okay, but why focus specifically on preventing its destruction? Is acetylcholine cleared out faster than other neurotransmitters or something?
That's a really important question. And yes, the sources highlight a unique reason for this focus. Acetylcholine is broken down by an incredibly efficient enzyme. Get the sources state, this enzyme can destroy approximately 5,000 molecules of acetylcholine per second.
Whoa, 5,000 molecules a second? That's incredibly fast, like an aggressive cleanup crew.
It really is. So inhibiting that highly efficient enzyme, even partially, is a very direct way to ensure the acetylcholine that is released hangs around a bit longer in the synapse, amplifying its signal, making that focus count more. And actually, speaking of this cleanup system, the sources include a rather concerning detail. They mention that pesticides and certain related chemicals, sometimes called cicids or biocides, are known to harm this specific acetylcholine system.
Harm it how? In humans, too.
Both in insects, which is often the target, and yes, in humans as well. They interfere with that critical enzyme or the neurotransmitter's function.
So they could potentially interfere with our ability to focus or learn effectively.
Exactly. Now, the sources don't present, definitive human studies saying X amount of exposure directly lowers IQ points or anything that specific, but they frame avoiding these substances as just common sense advice, given their known impact on this really foundational system for focus and learning.
Right. Protecting that acetylcholine mechanism just seems sensible for overall brain health.
Agreed.
The sources also briefly touched on using technology to help train focus itself.
Yeah, they described a specific type of neurofeedback glasses. It's pretty interesting. While you're reading, they apparently detect activity in your frontal lobe.
The focus part of the brain.
Right, the area associated with executive function and concentration. And if your attention starts to wander, which they detect through changes in your brainwave patterns, the glasses will actually darken.
Oh, wow. So it gives you immediate feedback like, hey, you drifted off.
Exactly. It's a form of neurofeedback, giving your brain real-time information about its own activity. By seeing that visual cue, the darkening lenses, your brain gets feedback on when its focus is dropping. The idea is it helps your brain learn how to maintain that desired state of concentration over time.
Interesting tech. Okay, so we've covered the stimulus part pretty well. Intense focus, acetylcholine release, targeting specific brain areas, maybe supporting acetylcholine levels or function, even using tech to help train that focus. But you mentioned earlier, and the source of stress, that improving the brain isn't just about the training itself. There's something else.
Yes, and this is maybe the most counterintuitive, but arguably the most critical part of the whole picture presented in your sources. The true permanent change, that neuroplasticity we talked about, the building of new connections, the consolidation of memory, it doesn't actually happen during the intense focus.
It happens afterwards, during rest.
Precisely. The sources place huge emphasis on the vital importance of what happens after the focused effort. The consolidation of memory and the actual building of those new neural connections are significantly facilitated after acetylcholine levels have dropped back down from that peak focus period,
And especially during sleep.
especially during deep sleep. That's highlighted repeatedly. Prioritizing deep sleep after studying or engaging in any kind of focused learning, well, it's presented as something that could dramatically accelerate the rate at which you learn and form those permanent connections.
So pulling an all-nighter to cram is actually counterproductive for long-term learning.
According to this model, yes, very much so. You need the sleep to make the learning stick.
Okay. And the sources also mention this consolidation can happen even when you're awake, not just sleeping.
That's right. They note it can also occur during wakeful rest. Specifically, they talk about the benefit of spending just a few minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, doing absolutely nothing between focused work sessions.
Nothing, like literally nothing.
They really emphasize nothing, not talking, not checking your phone, not listening to music, not mentally reviewing something else. Just quiet, eyes open or closed, not actively engaged in anything.
Why is that helpful?
The sources suggest that spending even these short periods in this do-nothing state during rest periods actually leads to better memory consolidation and more effective neural changes compared to constantly shifting from one stimulus to another.
So that downtime isn't really downtime, it's crucial rewiring time.
Essentially, yes. It's the
Okay.
brain integrating what you just did. It's
Mhm.
also why, you can practice something, really struggle with it, then take a break for a day or two, maybe sleep on it.
And you come back and you're suddenly much better.
Exactly. Your brain had that crucial rest period to build and consolidate the connections based on the stimulus you gave it during practice.
It was doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes while you were resting or sleeping.
That's the idea. So the principle, according to these sources, is really about a cycle. Focus intensely for a specific, relatively short period to create the stimulus. Then, take a break to allow for rest and consolidation, ideally, including a few minutes of that doing nothing state. Then, you can refocus.
And always prioritize sleep.
Always prioritize getting deep sleep at the end of the day, particularly after learning something new or challenging.
Okay. But to sustain that intense focus needed for the initial stimulus, you need a certain level of energy or alertness, right? You can't focus if you're half asleep.
You definitely do. The sources talk about needing sufficient brain excitation to sustain the effort required for that neural rewiring.
Mm.
However, and this is an important distinction they make, if you're too anxious, if you're overstimulated.
That's not good either.
Right. That heightened state actually increases the risk of making errors and isn't productive for learning. Anxiety isn't the same as productive alertness.
Okay, so what do they suggest if you find yourself too keyed up, too anxious to focus properly?
If you're in that state, the sources suggest methods specifically designed to reduce that anxiety. Things like meditating, stimulating the vagus nerve. They mention a brief massage on one side of the carotid artery for just a few seconds, taking a short nap, or using slow, controlled breathing
The
exercises.
10-second inhale, 10-second exhale thing.
Exactly, things like that. Techniques to calm the nervous system down before trying to focus.
Okay, so those are for when you're overstimulated. What if the problem is the opposite? You just feel sluggish, low energy, can't even muster the focus to begin with.
Ah, right. If you're dealing with low energy levels before you even start, that's when things like certain nootropics might come into play. Or more fundamentally, exercise, according to the sources.
And they singled out a specific type of exercise, didn't they?
They did. High-intensity interval training, or HIT. They highlight HIT specifically because it's known to increase BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Right, which is basically like miracle grow for your brain cells. HIT also significantly improves blood and oxygen flow to the brain, which we said was fundamental. And it can even stimulate the formation of new neurons, neurogenesis.
And some neurotransmitters themselves provide energy.
Yes, neurotransmitters like dopamine and adrenaline directly contribute more ATP. That's the energy currency your brain cells use, which influences those alertness levels needed for focus.
You know, this whole process, the intense effort followed by a recovery period for growth, it sounds incredibly similar to physical training, like building muscle.
The sources use that analogy explicitly.
Yeah.
They say the brain works much like a muscle in this regard. The intense effort and concentration you apply, releasing that acetylcholine, is like lifting weights with high intensity.
That's the stimulant.
That provides the necessary stimulus for development, generating those new neural connections, similar to how lifting weights causes tiny tears in muscle fibers that stimulate growth.
And just like muscles don't actually grow while
No.
you're lifting, but during rest.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that the true change, the learning, the actual development and strengthening of those neural connections happens during the recovery period when you're sleeping or in those periods of resting and doing nothing.
And if you skip the rest, if you just try to focus, focus, focus without breaks.
Well, think about it like trying to lift weights intensely nonstop without ever resting between sets. You just exhaust yourself. You wouldn't get stronger. You're probably weaker or injured.
Yeah.
Similarly, continuously trying to focus intensely without allowing those periods of rest afterwards means your cognitive capacity will likely degrade over time instead of building. You simply can't sustain peak focus indefinitely. You need that recovery to consolidate the gains and replenish your resources.
That makes a lot of sense. Finally, the sources did briefly mention some specific supplements, almost like a mental pre-workout list.
Yes, they provided a quick note on specific supplements that they suggest could potentially boost mental performance during those effort periods. These are framed as things that might increase neuronal ATP, that energy currency, or make more neurotransmitters readily available.
Okay, what was on that list again, just for reference?
Let's see. The list included 5 grams of creatine, 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of L-tyrosine, which is a precursor for dopamine, 600 milligrams of alpha-GPC, that choline precursor we discussed earlier,
Yay.
0.300 milligrams of phosphatidylserine, which is a type of fat crucial for building healthy brain cell membranes,
Yeah.
and 400 micrograms, note, the unit there of huperzine A, that substance that helps inhibit acetylcholine destruction.
Okay.
They mentioned these briefly, saying it wasn't the main topic, but they did provide those specific amounts from the source material. Got it. So, okay, bringing this all together, improving your brain function based on these sources, it's really not about just grinding away endlessly, is it? It's about a much more specific strategic process.
Absolutely. It's about first ensuring the basic needs are met, good blood flow, enough oxygen. Then creating intense targeted stimulus through focused effort, which releases that key player, acetylcholine, maybe supporting or protecting those key chemical systems. And then, crucially, allowing for deep rest and sleep.
Because that rest period is where the real magic happens.
That's where the real permanent rewiring and consolidation of learning actually occurs, according to this framework. It's powerful stimulus combined with essential strategic recovery.
Understanding that cycle, that rhythm of focused effort followed by critical rest, that seems to be the core insight from these sources on how we can actually build lasting cognitive capacity.
I think that captures it well. So what does all of this mean for you listening right now? Well, optimizing your brain might involve rethinking your daily structure pretty significantly. It suggests it's not just about how hard you focus, but maybe even more importantly, how you schedule and prioritize your recovery. The idea that taking just a few minutes to genuinely do nothing between tasks could actually be accelerating your learning. That's pretty wild.
It is counterintuitive in our always-on culture.
Definitely. Or even considering the potential impact of environmental factors like certain pesticides or chemicals on your brain's foundational chemistry for focus. These are really powerful takeaways from this deep dive into the sources you shared with us. It makes you think, how will you integrate focused stimulus with purposeful rest starting today?
Definitely some food for thought there.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for providing the material that spurred this whole discussion.